The first part of this course deals with answering the question, why do teachers need to know about assessment and evaluation? And the answer to that is actually pretty simple, and that is that better assessment equates to better teaching. And there are three important areas that this course addresses in terms of doing a better job with assessments. And the first area has to do with being able to evaluate existing assessment instruments. The second area has to do with creating your own valid, reliable, and fair assessment items and instruments. And the third area has to do with collecting, interpreting, and evaluating evaluation data or assessment data that you might collect. And part of your evaluation would then inform how to improve either the creation of your own assessment items or perhaps better inform whether or not an existing assessment item is good in the first place.
Here's a very good example of why it is very important for educators to be able to do a good job of evaluating existing assessment instruments. I went to the Teaching Resources Center at Radford University and I located this book, The Virginia Adventure. It is a social studies type book, mostly focusing on Virginia history, that is intended for middle school aged kids. And it consists of a number of chapters, and at the end of each chapter there is a chapter assessment that is designed for teachers to be able to make copies of it and use to distribute to their kids if they want to, if they need to. Now, here is one of the assessment sets or question sets from one of the chapter assessments, and just this one set of matching, where you're supposed to fill in the blank with the item on the left to the in the correct statement on the right. And just this one set is so full of problems. Let me just take a few moments here to talk about them. First of all, item number 4 up at the very top, blank were considered their master's property. That's bad practice in terms of assessment to put the blank at the very beginning of a sentence. Mainly because people who are younger readers or don't have as much experience have a very difficult time just trying to make sense of what the sentence is even asking if it begins with a blank. So you're already disadvantaging a certain type of learner by including it that way. But that's not the only problem with this set. Item number 5, right underneath it, many people in the blank thought it was wrong for anyone to own another person. So many people in the North, it could be, right? Many people in the Union, that could be a correct answer. Many people in the Underground Railroad, that's possible too. If the answer key for this only included one of those as the right answer, and there's no indication in the directions up here that the students had to pick the best answer and use it only once, no indication, then it would be difficult for you to determine if the students learned what you wanted them from the chapter, or even if the students themselves learned what they wanted from the chapter. Item number 9, the northern states were called the blank. They were called the blank. Were they called the North? Seems like that to me. Were they called the Union? Could be right. So it's either a Q or there's two possible answers. Both of those are bad design. Even number 7, the blank had no tracks and no engine, but it did have stations. Now, if I knew nothing about the Civil War at all, nothing, if I never read a word from the chapter and I learned not one thing about it, I could go down this list of possible choices, and to me, railroad would be the obvious correct answer. So it's really important to consider these things because if you want to measure whether or not the learners acquired the skills that are intended from the chapter, and yet if you can just guess the right answer because of a couple of word cues, then you're getting a false positive in that case, and you want assessor. The end of chapter assessment also had some short answer or short essay, I guess, questions, but that does make you wonder. For example, on this item 12, was President Lincoln for or against slavery? So if I was a learner and I wrote President Lincoln was against slavery, is that it? Did I get 100%? I sure think I did. It was a complete sentence. But what are you really measuring with something like that? Are you measuring an understanding of President Lincoln and what he supported or advocated for, or are you measuring whether they can write a complete sentence, or is it both? And if it's both, that's okay. It's just that you would think that a little more direction here would be needed in terms of what do you really want to measure from a response to that. And finally, in the same assessment, there's a collection of true and false, and true and false are often difficult to write well, but many of these are actually fairly ambiguous. Like, women were not able to help during the Civil War. Are they all women? I'm sure there were some women who were not able to help, and I'm sure there were some who were. Well, I know there were historically, but a statement like this it could be true and it could be false, to be honest with you. It's another similar one. After the Civil War, all slaves became free. If I said that was false, I could probably find many examples of slaves that did not become free the day after the Civil War ended, or the week after, or the month after, or the year after. If it means eventually after the Civil War, then perhaps that would be a true statement, but it would have to be qualified, and it's not a good true and false item if you're trying to measure something specific, and it would need to be qualified immensely. So here in this one end of chapter assessment, I was able, anybody would be able to see that there are many revisions that would need to be made in order for this assessment to be able to be useful in determining whether or not students did in fact learn some specific things from that chapter experience. And again, this might have been an extreme example, but the reality is it's not always that easy to write good assessments, and a lot of textbook companies don't have professional assessment writers writing the assessments, and so they almost always need to be scrutinized by good educators in order to serve the purpose that needs to be served. Okay, so this class is about assessment, obviously, and the course text author, James Popham, defines assessment as a formal attempt to determine a learner's status with respect to educational variables of interest. Now, I put an asterisk by learner or learners because the author uses the word student or students, and I think that's a little limiting because I work as a consultant, and I will use all of these skills in good assessment development as when I train adults for certain things as well. And if you're in a training session, you generally don't regard the people in training, the adults in training, as students per se. That's more of a classroom kind of term. So I use the broader term learners, but it's the same thing. You know, it's what I mean the same thing. But a formal attempt. I want to talk for a minute here about what I mean by a formal attempt and where in a typical learner's experience are formal attempts typically made to measure educational variables of interest. Conversation by focusing on one particular type of learner. So our learner in this case came into this world as a little baby, and that little baby, there's a lot that little baby does not know how to do, a lot that little baby needs to learn how to do in order to be successful and happy in their life when they get older. Interestingly, though, at least to me, little babies do come into the world having learned or having possessed certain behaviors, which I find fascinating. My first child, my daughter, came into this world, and right from the very beginning, she already knew how to breastfeed, and that was without looking at any of my PowerPoints. I gave no notes on it, and yet, boom, she could do it. So that's always, instinctual behaviors are always just fascinating to me. But baby comes into the world and doesn't know how to do a lot of things, but after some time and experience, the baby grows, matures, develops, and also acquires a number of skills through both formal and informal experiences. So in this case, when that baby reaches age of, I don't know, 5 or 6 or so, maybe 7, can sit down with a book and read that book. So reading is a skill set, comprises a very large set of communication skills specific to the symbols of words, and the baby has acquired that. Not just through maturation, but also certainly through experiences. So the baby goes into life and has some experiences and emerges 6 or 7 years later with having learned this skill set. So, what were they specifically? Because we're going to be looking at what is assessed and where, in more of a formal setting. One way to think about learning experiences is to think about a classroom experiences. Now I am not going to suggest for a minute that most of the experiences that people have that prepare them and teach them how to read, I'm not going to pretend for a minute that happens in a classroom. Certainly classrooms and experiences in classrooms, particularly in the primary grades, definitely contribute to somebody learning how to read and how to read well and how to read better, but that's only one part, and in many cases perhaps a small part of actually acquiring that skill set and getting really good at it. But when you look at a classroom experience from just sort of from an outsider's perspective, you might not see all of the specific things going on that do constitute an effective learning experience for the learners, or an effective instructional experience for the learners. But if you are an educator, you do know that there are very specific pieces to an effective learning experience. I have them diagrammed here. So let me just talk briefly about these, and then I'll focus on, well, where in this process do learners are they formally assessed? So first of all, I'll change my marking to yellow. All learning experiences kind of begin with a beginning of some sort, and in instruction we typically refer to those as an introduction. And good introductions include a lot of really important pieces, like, for example, motivating the learners and communicating clearly what they're learning how to do. They move, once something is introduced, you move into a series of activities, and information is presented in some way, formally or informally. And at the center of the activities in terms of effectiveness are a variety of practice and feedback exercises. Can't learn anything without a little practice, as you know. And moving from practice and feedback, then it's very common to have some type of a review experience that goes beyond more practice and actually encourages the learners to reflect on what they learned how to do, and how they learned how to do it, and why it was important to them, that kind of thing. All of that is good, a good review. And certain things happen within the learning experience. There are reflections that learners go throughout the experience. There are support mechanisms that learners might take advantage of, or scaffolds at different times. There is communication that goes on between learners and instructors and learners and the information. All of that is part of the learning experience. Typically, there's some type of collaboration, not always, but typically there is some interaction socially or formally with teachers and other students. Those are all factors that influence and affect kind of the main experiences that learners have within instruction. And the instruction is defined by the overall context, and that is all of the factors that influence and affect who's learning, what they're learning, when they're learning it, where, how, the overall context. And those are things that educators typically spend a good deal of their design work kind of focusing on. And then, of course, there's almost always some type of an assessment at the end of a formal learning experience in order to determine whether or not the learners learned what was intended. So schematically, this is a picture of what it looks like in an instructional experience. There is formal assessments, and that is formal being the teacher is formally assessing. Oftentimes a teacher will formally assess students in an introduction by way of a pretest perhaps, or at least to see where learners are at. Oftentimes the introduction is really, the assessments that go on there are dovetail from a previous instructional experience. Now practice and feedback are certainly formal assessments, or they can be. Homework problems, problems at the end of chapters or embedded throughout. Problems that teachers put on the board or just ask of the class. That's a formal way of assessing whether the learner's status with respect to having learned what is being practiced. And also, as I mentioned before, there's usually a formal assessment at the end of an instructional experience, and you probably know those as chapter tests or midterms or final exams, that kind of thing. So a way of assessing at the end of the learning experiences just what your status is in terms of learning. So those are the formal ways, formal places in an instructional experience where educators typically formally assess learning. There are also many informal ways that both the teachers and the learners will assess themselves. And it's good just to at least kind of review what they are. You can informally assess where you're at during an introduction, just kind of a general sense of where learners are at based on their reactions to things that are said or things that are brought up at the beginning of a learning experience. Certainly at any time throughout activities and information, practice, feedback, there's lots of mental practice that can go on. Students will often, if they're older students, write notes and create their own flashcards, their own note cards, different ways to practice. Those would all be considered some informal assessment approaches. And certainly a review could include an informal assessment of how you feel about where you're at with respect to having learned the things that you were supposed to learn. So those are some areas in which some informal assessments take place. Certainly asking learners to reflect on certain things throughout the learning experience could be regarded as informal assessment. A lot of informal assessment goes on among and between the learners and teachers in terms of communication, in terms of the social interactivity that goes on, a lot of informally there. So this class focuses on assessment as a formal attempt to determine a learner's status with respect to educational variables of interest, and so we really are going to focus our attention on those formal assessments that would occur perhaps as a pretest, as part of practice and feedback that you might develop as an educator, or the terminal assessment that you would have at the end of the learning experience. So that's where we're going to be focusing our attention throughout the class.
So what variables might be of interest to professional educators or teachers? Well, I'll use an example to try to explain some of the common categories of variables of interest. Suppose you were a teacher in perhaps middle school, and you designed a unit on renewable energy sources. And in that unit, you were going to have your students working in groups, and they were going to create some type of project or presentation. And your ultimate goal with the instructional experience is that you would want your students to be able to distinguish between renewable and non-renewable energy sources, to be able to identify the current state, perhaps, of renewable energy source use in our country or in our society, our culture, and maybe even explain some of the challenges with trying to promote renewable energy source development and use in our country. So those would be some pretty good instructional intentions that you would have for your experience. Now, probably the most common and important variable of interest is going to be the expected terminal outcome performance, and that is how will your students perform on measurements of the skills, those specific skills. Can they successfully distinguish between renewable and non-renewable sources? Or can they adequately explain some of the challenges trying to implement renewable energy resource programs in this country? So those would be the expected terminal outcomes. That's the intention, the instructional intention. Now, you might also be interested in the unexpected terminal outcome performance, and you might be interested in measuring that. There might be some critical or creative thinking skills that you you would be interested in measuring. The unit wasn't necessarily designed for that, but you want to measure that. You're having the students work in groups, and so perhaps measuring their collaboration skills is something that it might have been an unintended consequence of having them work in groups, or maybe it was an intended one. But that would be a variable that might be worth measuring. Now, there is, of course, another common variable of interest, embedded practice performance. And that would be, for example, giving students some practice in the middle of the experience where you communicated some energy sources, and you wanted the students to practice identifying which constituted renewable energy sources and which constituted non-renewable. So that would be embedded practice performance, and a very common type of variable. Another variable that might be of interest are the expected attitudes of the learners in the experience. You would want the learners likely to be interested in the topic of renewable energy sources. You would expect, at least I think, you might expect that they would value the importance of the topic, the importance of using renewable energy resources and trying to promote their development and use for now and in the future. So you could ask questions about that, and that would be expected. You could also ask, or you could also measure attitudes that were not necessarily in the design of the learning experience, but they might be of interest to you. And those might be attitudes associated with working in groups, attitudes associated perhaps with using maybe some new technology that you decided to implement as part of the experience, attitudes about perhaps some of the media that you chose to communicate during the experience. Maybe you showed part of a film and you don't necessarily expect that the students would say that was one of the greatest films that I've seen this recently, but it might be something like that might be of value to you to measure. Another variable of interest that you might have as an educator are instructional component perceptions. And by that might be really important to you. But what I mean by that is how good of a job do the students think that you did introducing the topic of renewable energy sources? Was it relevant? Was it motivating? And were the students clear about what they were supposed to learn from the experience and what they were supposed to do or accomplish throughout? Were the information and examples clear? Was there enough practice? And was the feedback good? So those are instructional components, and educators often are interested in recording what the learners, or how the learners felt about those and the adequacy of those components. And finally, you might be interested in measuring variables associated with social interaction concerns. And that is, since you created this learning experience and there are, you use groups, you might be interested in learning about any concerns that the students might have had as working in a group. Obviously, for most educators, doing some group work is a really important thing, but the only way to successfully do that is if the learners know how to collaborate constructively with each other. And so collecting information, collecting data on the variables associated with constructive collaboration might represent some important variables that you as an educator would want to, well, you'd be interested in them. You'd be interested in measuring them. So those are just some, so these are just some common variables of interest that typical educators might want to measure in some capacity. So those represent some of the important variables that teachers or educators might choose to assess. And this is a good time to bring up a very important distinction between assessment and evaluation. What we mean by assessment in the field is simply the status of learners with respect to those variables. You're just making observations. What can they do or not do? What do they think or not think? How do they feel or not feel about related to those variables? That's assessment. Evaluation is putting a value judgment on that. So, for example, if you observe a learner in the renewable energy unit on a quiz, and that learner scores 7 out of 10 on the items associated with the outcomes for that learning experience. 7 out of 10, that's an assessment. You assessed, and that's the overall score or picture. Now, if you choose to say that is a C, if you want to put a label on it, a C, that's evaluation. You have evaluated. You put a value judgment on that assessment. If it's a passable grade, then that's a value judgment. But the score itself is simply that's what you observed. That's what you assessed. Another example would be the Virginia Standards of Learning scores. When learners take those assessments, the scores that they get are just that. They're just observations. They are an assessment. But putting a value judgment on an individual score or a school's scores or a school division scores, that would be an evaluation. And that would raise, and how you use that evaluation, again, is completely value-based. Are overall scores acceptable? Do they indicate that some changes need to be made in terms of teachers or instruction, or even maybe the assessment itself needs to be addressed in some way? So those issues relate to evaluation. And in this course, we are going to focus explicitly on just assessment, and we're not going to get into factors associated with putting a value judgment on those numbers. However, it's hard to separate those two, and that's because assessment is so valuable that when it is done formatively, then those assessments are used you measure the status of learners, individual learners or group of learners, and you can use that information to help shape the instructional experiences themselves, or the experiences in the classroom themselves. That would be formative assessment. But we do use summative assessments to determine whether or not your instruction was in fact successful. And that then would result in an overall evaluation, your own evaluation of yourself. But it would be based on those summative assessments. So So those are just some of the important reasons why learning about assessment and getting better at it can equal being a better teacher.